And with that, we'll go ahead and start tonight's presentation. By the way, everyone, thanks for being here. If you want to let me know where you're from in the chat, please do. Otherwise, we'll move on. My name is Mike Shelby here. I run the Early Warning Network. Again, thanks for being here. I know your time's valuable, a lot like mine, so I'll make sure we don't waste it. Tonight, we're going to break down color revolutions and look how elements of the progressive left and the far left are planning a color revolution against the incoming Trump administration. They're going to start with protests, but these things, they go through phases. We'll talk about that tonight. So again, I'm Mike. I'm a former intelligence analyst. I got out of the Army as a sergeant, which is a non-commissioned officer, NCO. And then I went over to the dark side and got into intelligence contracting, both as a soldier and a contractor. I was deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan part of every year from 2006 to 2011. And then in 2016, I became very interested in violent social movements like BLM and Antifa. And if I can just share with you my tipping point here, I didn't start out a Trump guy, but I watched I was watching these Trump supporters being assaulted and accosted. And you've probably seen this video before. Back in early 2016, I was really shocked actually at how violent the left was towards innocent Trump supporters. And I watched this video of this lady. She was a Trump supporter, and they were throwing eggs and like tomatoes and waving Mexican flags in her face. And if there were no cameras there, I don't know what could have happened. But these people it was just a feral mob basically accosting this woman. And so I watched that video, and it was at that exact moment that I started tracking Antifa and other far left groups. And I started attending their events and demonstrations across the country. And I have a lot of firsthand knowledge about the far left and a unique understanding of that threat because I'd spent so much time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so back in 2016, I started writing intelligence reports, and I started this early warning report, writing reports about stuff that no one was seeing on the news. They weren't getting, this was really crucial information. Americans weren't getting it from the news. They weren't getting it from Fox News or from Newsmax or OAN, definitely not from mainstream media sources. And so this is pretty crucial to our mission here at Early Warning Network, because I don't want you to see things on the news after it happens, when there's no time to react, when we can actually see things coming. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I started warning people back in 2019 specifically that the pot was about to boil over and that we are going to have a national crisis with these far left groups. And then it ended up happening in 2020. And by the way, I went back and read some media depictions of this event with this lady Trump supporter. And here's what Politico reported. She taunted the protesters, and they responded by tossing food at her. And they were like John Smoltz throwing eggs and tomatoes at this lady. John Smoltz was a professional baseball pitcher back in the 90s when I was a kid. It was serious. They were not just tossing food at her. And it was at this exact moment that I realized the media just lies incessantly. So today I'm a low-intensity conflict analyst here at the Early Warning Network. We're a team of intelligence and special operations veterans. We track political, social, and economic risk. And then we warn our members about those risks when they emerge. And I'm going to warn you about an emerging risk tonight. When we look at the left, we're really looking at a big tent. And we're really talking about a handful of different factions. And we'll start over here on the far left, which is on the far left side of your screen. And these are the revolutionaries that I refer to as the far left. I include anarcho-communist groups, the radical and revolutionary abolitionist groups like Antifa, and the John Brown Gun Club, and the rest of the armed pro-gun socialist groups. Socialist Rifle Association is not listed, but they're one. And these are the groups that some of their members got violent. And that is the violence that you saw during the summer insurrection of 2020. In the far left, I also include openly communist political parties here, like Communist Party USA and the Revolutionary Communist Party, Revolutionary Communists of America. there's a few other communist groups, but which is to say the left is not just this single monolith. And a lot of these factions actually do not get along with each other. There's a lot of internecine fighting that happens as well. These communist groups don't openly advocate violence, but I did sit through one of their party conference earlier this year, and there was some talk about violence being necessary to overthrow the state, but there were no overt calls for violence or for any specific violent action. And the thing about a lot of these revolutionary groups is that there is this tacit agreement that violence will be necessary in order to achieve their communist utopia. But the funny thing is few of them are actually willing to go and kid up, right? The violence is always going to happen at the hands of some other communist, but they are actively building that capacity for violence. And then we have our kind of run-of-the-mill social justice and political activist groups, the progressive NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the groups that actually fund, that use the money and distribute it to all these groups, the advocacy groups, the so-called grassroots networks, and they are social democrat and progressive groups. They're reformist. They're not revolutionary. They don't want to topple the system. They don't want to abolish the government. They just want to take it over. And that is, again, reformist and not revolutionary. And then finally here, there are your center-left moderate Democrats. And so what we're left with here is a pretty broad spectrum. And again, there's a lot of overlap and policy agreements. But if there's one distinction between the left and the far left, it is this. The left wants reform. Guys like Bernie Sanders and gals like Elizabeth Warren don't want to overthrow the government. They want to reform it. They want to take power of it. They want to introduce socialism, and they want to be in charge. Whereas the far left actually is revolutionary. They don't really get along with the social democrats and the reformers. The far left wants to topple everything. They want to topple the government. They want to topple capitalism. They want to abolish the police, abolish the prisons. It's a matter of time before they go after churches. Just really incredibly destructive social policies. And so this is the distinction that I make between the left and the far left. And I'll make it many times in tonight's presentation. But know this, all of these groups form the Trump Resistance 2.0. So we're about to get into some courses of action tonight. These are 3 potential courses of action that the left in general could take. I want to point out just a few things briefly. Once Trump takes office, it is not going to be a far leap to go back to 2017 style political violence and unrest. And a lot of people talk about Trump's popular vote victory, which was significant. However, keep this in mind. The anti-Trump vanguard is really just one major crisis away from rebuilding a national resistance movement. And yes, it has been very quiet recently. And we'll start to see some more protests tick up, especially starting this Saturday. But these people are strategizing a way forward, and we're going to get a first glimpse. I think the real first glimpse is going to be on or about January 18th. We'll talk more about these events later. But for now, we're going to start off with the most likely course of action. This is my baseline expectation. And then we're going to get into the more dangerous and what I think is the most dangerous course of action here. So the baseline case is that we just see a return to lawfare in political warfare against the Trump administration. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to tell you the exact tactics that they're going to use. And then we'll get into more dangerous, which is the color revolution, and most dangerous, insurrectionary and terrorist violence. So these are my baseline expectations. Number one, all these groups are saying they want to tie up Trump in the courts, get some federal judge to say something is unconstitutional, get their quick win in. And really they want to pierce the perception of Teflon Don. They want to show that the left can actually achieve policy victories against the Trump administration. Again, primarily using federal judges, maybe going all the way up to the Supreme Court. They also want to focus on local recruiting and organizing. One of the largest progressive groups rolled out this program called Neighbor to Neighbor. And if you just think about this, I don't know how many actual members of Indivisible there are. You probably remember Indivisible back from 2016. That's when they started. But let's just say theoretically there's 1 million members of Indivisible. And through this Neighbor to Neighbor program and this focus on local recruiting and organizing, if every one member of Indivisible can get one person, then they double to 2 million. Or if they're starting from 5 million, they double to 10 million. Or if there's 10 million, they double to 20 million. So they're trying to grow their movement very rapidly by focusing on local recruiting and organizing. They also want to Trump-proof blue states with Democratic trifectas. So back in 2017, there were 6 states with a Democratic trifecta. That is a Democrat governor, a Democrat state house, and a Democrat state senate. In 2025, there are now 15 states with Democrat trifectas. And so they have recognized this. They talk about this, and they say, we have so much more political and economic power, and we need to use that. So they want to use blue state economic power to counter Trump policies. So use a lot of the money and power that's in California and New York and get that money into the political fight. They also want to use blue state political power to resist Trump implementation, or Trump's policies from being implemented. They're basically saying, yeah, sure, GOP Congress can pass whatever law they want, but those laws have to be enforced. They have to be implemented. And there are multiple efforts to block the enforcement in these states, or to use state assets to not cooperate. Next, they want to fracture the MAGA coalition, and they want to reduce the capacity to govern. There's several other tactics involved. Ultimately, for the next 2 years, they want to build up momentum for a big blue wave heading into November 2026. This is their big thing. They say, look, we've just got to wait out 2 years, and then Democrats can take back the House or the Senate, and basically anything Trump wants to do gets stopped. So unless Republicans carry the House and the Senate in the midterms, I mean, we all know how that works. As a matter of fact, Democrats are, one of the things that they said on this call, let's just look to 2028, the next election real quick. One of the things they said on this call is they highlighted that Trump won all the swing states. And they said, all we have to do is throw massive amounts of money into 7 states. And so heading into 2028, that's where most of their money and most of their attention are going to. So if you live in one of those swing states, I mean, you also know how that works. All right, let's talk about the more dangerous course of action, which is a color revolution. The picture on your screen is a snapshot of Euromaidan. It was one of the more popular color revolutions. This took place in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. A color revolution is a unique type of conflict, and we classify that as irregular warfare. It is a form of irregular warfare. It's also called low-intensity conflict. But this is actual war. It is actual warfare. This is the kind of stuff that we see the U.S. State Department and CIA involved in overseas. And it's not just the U.S. that's involved. A lot of other countries support these types of popular revolutions as well. We just know about them mainly from the old Soviet republics. What makes color revolutions unique and effective is that they are predominantly nonviolent, and they're almost always large-scale protest movements. And the way they win is by exploiting weaknesses and vulnerabilities within an existing government. And I'll talk a lot more about strategies and tactics later on. But the point is that these color revolutions use a specific color to represent their ideals of freedom and solidarity. And these color revolutions often play out over weeks or months. So in most cases, we're not talking about years. These things happen relatively rapidly. And this may seem counterintuitive because how can unarmed protesters defeat a government that's protected by military and intelligence services and secret police and security forces? Well, it all has to do with soft power. Non-violent revolutions are a lot more common than you think. Here, this is an incomplete list where color revolutions or these popular revolutions have been successful. A color revolution is a form of, again, low intensity conflict, and it exists in the gray area. So it's beneath outright war, but it's above outright peace. So low intensity conflict exists beneath the threshold of conventional war, which is a high intensity conflict like World War II or the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. But it exists above the threshold of routine peaceful competition. So we all say, obviously, America is not at war with itself, at least not yet. We're definitely not at peace. And so a lot of this goes back to how the left and the right see war. Someone once said that the political right sees war or conflict as a switch. It's either on or it's off. But the left sees conflict as a dial that can be turned up, and then it can be turned back down, and then it can be turned back up as the situation warrants. So low intensity conflict is an umbrella term that encompasses everything from violent social movements to terrorism to guerrilla movements, popular revolutions, color revolutions, and up to and including insurgency. So an insurgency is an armed attempt to overthrow a government. These are all forms of low intensity conflict, and we have seen forms of most of these right here in the United States from 2008 through 2021. And I don't think it's over. When we talk about color revolutions, and specifically this manual, which is From Dictatorship to Democracy, we're really talking about how groups of people topple dictatorial regimes. This manual right here was intended as a guide on how to do that. Now, I can acknowledge that Trump is not a dictator. We live in a federal system. I think it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for Trump to actually become a dictator. And after November 2024, I don't think the average American actually believes Trump is a dictator either. I think a lot of that talk has just become very, very stale. And so this is the hurdle. If you're a member of Trump Resistance 2.0, this is the hurdle that you have to overcome. First, they have to create popular dissatisfaction against the Trump presidency. Not just some dissatisfaction, but popular dissatisfaction, meaning widespread, a large plurality or majority of really irate people. And traditionally, this is done by painting your opponent as illegitimate, because if you have an illegitimate president, then the next logical conclusion is that he needs to be replaced with someone who is legitimate. And that was what the Russia hoax and the lawfare and prosecutions and political warfare and the impeachment were all aimed at. We saw in those things the building blocks of a popular revolution being fomented against Trump during his first term. Now, more recently, because Trump won the popular vote and the Electoral College, is a much larger challenge to characterize him as illegitimate. And so the big problem here is that you need to get a majority of Americans to believe that he is illegitimate, and I just don't think that's going to happen. And so what these left-wing groups have to do is find another way to build this popular dissatisfaction. And ultimately, what these progressive groups want is Trump's resignation. And so the way that they're going to do this is through manufacturing crises and then exploiting and amplifying that dissatisfaction. And that is what mass mobilization protests and then the subsequent amplification through media coverage, that's why they're so important, because they create this perception of popular dissatisfaction. And that was clearly the intent behind the unrest of 2020. They will obviously make another attempt against Trump somewhere between this month and 2028. I can't tell you exactly when this is going to kick off again, but the far left is, first of all, they will make another attempt. And so the thing that we have to look out for is which of these crises that are manufactured is going to lead to a revolutionary rupture. So on the chart here, these three images, we're looking at three different parts of what this revolutionary rupture actually looks like. So first we start with fault lines. They're on the left-hand side of that image. It was racial in 2020, but fault lines in general, they are religious, they could be class-based, economic. So there's lots of potential fault lines here in the United States, and we call these things social cleavages. And this is literally where the fabric of society starts to rip apart. And by the way, if you're on the left, if you want that revolutionary rupture, you have to first create and then exploit these social cleavages. It's it's impossible to launch any kind of revolution when there are no big fault lines, because you're not going to be able to get enough people out in the street. And then in the middle there, we have accelerators of conflict. So this is how the media covers certain events. Those could accelerate conflict. Sporadic violence or specific government policies could raise the temperature. And this is when we bring our pot to a low boil. The water's hot. We can start to see the little bubbles popping up. It's at a low boil. And then it just keeps getting hotter and hotter until it's about to boil out of the pot. And that is what we call the trigger event. And triggers are specific events. Sometimes they're a string of events that cause a revolutionary rupture. And again, a revolutionary rupture is when the fabric of society rips apart. So Lexington and Concord, Fort Sumter, the MLK assassination that kicked off the 1968 riots, George Floyd in late May 2020 kicked off over 100 straight days of riots. Those were all trigger events. So before you can get a trigger event, before you can actually kick this thing off, you need accelerators of conflict that build up pressure inside the system, and enough pressure so that it explodes. And before you can start building that pressure, you need to exploit the social cleavages and drive a wedge into those fault lines. And so when we look back on 2016 to 2020, we saw a Trump term that was full of manufactured crises, full of the things that tore at the fabric of our society, that built pressure up inside the system until it was just bound to explode at some point. And it was every week. I mean, pretty much every day, there was something else. There was some new thing that was used to agitate people. And that's the kind of pressure campaign that the left needs to rebuild starting this month. And a lot of people predicted riots in the street if Trump was elected. And I started telling people last summer to take a deep breath, because there was not enough pressure built up into the system for us to get that kind of revolutionary rupture if Trump won. And we haven't had these mass protests or riots yet. So they are in the early stages of building up this pressure. It's not going to happen immediately, but the left does need to get to work to get our society back to that point. And now there's some other prerequisites of a color revolution. The one I want to really home in on here is powerful NGOs capable of developing a strategic plan for revolution, and also capable of organizing and directing these resistance campaigns. This is described in this book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. And I read that. You need powerful NGOs. And I just thought, we have powerful left-wing NGOs in this country. Like they have almost everything they need to do this. There are, in terms of groups that are trying to rebuild this movement, there are two organizations. One is Refuse Fascism, and the other is called the Election Response Center. And they've been holding strategy calls. And this is exactly the kind of stuff they are discussing. How can they get the resistance and get American society back to the point to foment a revolutionary rupture against Trump where the dam breaks? And we've sat through all these strategy calls. They still have weekly calls that we jump in and monitor. But they are planning direct action to oppose the Trump administration. So let's talk about why this revolution has to be predominantly nonviolent to work. And some people, again, may think that's counterintuitive, but this is ultimately about hard power and soft power. Hard power is the use of force and coercion that is the credible threat of violence. Traditionally, when we talk about warfare, we're talking about the exercise of organized murder. Okay, that is hard power. That is violence and coercion. But then there's also soft power, and that includes things like reputation and persuasion and influence, and most importantly, moral authority. And this is the main point here on nonviolence and why resistance elements in this context choose nonviolence. Violent resistance movements often turn into civil wars, and they don't want that. These violent resistance movements that turn into civil wars, they carry very negative consequences. There's also no guarantee of success. And the state has more hard power than you. They have more troops and more personnel. They have bigger and better weapons. They can kill a lot more of you than you can of them. And in these violent conflicts, we're typically talking about guerrilla wars and insurgencies, which inflict a very large number of casualties. The average length of an insurgency is about 10 years. The left do not want to fight a 10-year insurgency. That is why they are going to choose predominantly non-violent methods of opposition and revolution, maybe up until the very end. So the way to think about that, when I look at the length of an insurgency, on average, they're 10 years. So I just break that down and say about half last 5 years and the other half last about 20 years. So who wants an armed conflict with a government that lasts from the time your son is a newborn to the time he's graduating high school? That is a very long time. Whereas these color revolutions are typically measured in weeks to months. And that is because of how a color revolution is waged. And that is also another excellent reason why the left may pursue a color revolution. So the overall goal of a color revolution is to topple an existing government, or in the case of Trump, to topple the Trump administration, to force him from office in the shortest amount of time and with the least amount of human suffering as possible. And the way they do that is by creating vulnerabilities within the foundations of government and then attacking them nonviolently. So government sits on three pillars: legitimacy, authority, and capacity. Legitimacy is the recognized right of a government to rule. So in our case, a lawfully elected president is viewed as legitimate, whereas a president who steals an election, whether that's real or perceived, will be seen, at least by some, as illegitimate. Authority is the ability to enforce your laws. So a government that is unable to enforce its laws in places has no authority in those places. In places where no one recognizes that authority, the government doesn't have authority. That's why the U.S. can't go into, say, Canada and enforce U.S. laws there, because they have no authority there. Not yet, at least. I say that tongue in cheek. And finally, capacity is the ability to carry out the state's duties. So government may be legitimate and it may have authority, but if it lacks the money or the manpower to carry out its duties, then its legitimacy and authority will suffer. And so these are the targets of a color revolution. When you get mass political defiance striking at the foundation of legitimacy by convincing other powerful people and powerful institutions of the illegitimacy of the government, when they strike at authority by getting others to ignore laws or by convincing others that government authority is immoral and therefore doesn't need to be recognized or obeyed. And finally, when they strike at capacity by reducing access to the things that a government needs to function. So that's money, natural resources, human capital. The ability to get large groups of people, talking about mass participation, to attack these pillars of a government in unison is more powerful than a standing army. Legitimacy here, especially, is the Achilles heel of any government. When a resistance element or resistance movement erodes the public's trust in a government and encourages the view that a government is illegitimate, then the people no longer have a moral duty to obey it. And they will either demand or create a new government. And that's how you get shadow governments. And that's how you get revolutions. When enough people drop their allegiance to an existing government in favor of an alternate government. And that is the primary challenge and really the chief objective for the far left going forward. So a color revolution doesn't need weapons or violence to attack the political power of a regime, or in this case, of the Trump administration, a lawfully elected President Trump. The left can use any opportunity to foment or exploit a crisis that undermines that legitimacy. So they may try to provoke an overreaction by a government, such as, police beating or maybe killing peaceful protesters. They would love for that to happen. That's going to be incredibly incendiary if that does end up happening. That is going to undermine the legitimacy in the eyes of the people watching these videos. Or they can cook up scandals in criminal probes or criminal charges or accusations of corruption, which don't have to be false and they don't have to be true either. But they further undermine a government's legitimacy. And this should be sounding pretty familiar to everybody. All citizens of a country exist somewhere on the spectrum of cooperation to defiance. And the chief goal of any revolutionary is to move the mass of the people from some level of support to some level of defiance. And this is what they attempted to do from 2016 to 2020. And so a substantial portion of this manual that I just showed you is dedicated to the concept of reducing support for a government, or in this the manual's case, reducing support for a dictator. And they do that by compelling supporters to drop their support. And it talks about a lot of things, but one of the most important things it talks about in this manual is about how to approach the military and military officers and police units and how to influence them to resist orders or to even encourage defections. And so I think this is one thing that we're going to see quite heavily over the next couple of years at least. So here's my take on the far left in 2025. They are smaller, but I'm concerned that they will be more violent. I know they're smaller for a handful of reasons. Number one, there's not been anything to speak of really since. There's been three things. There was the Jane's Revenge, where they went around and firebombed a bunch of pro-life clinics. There was Stop Cop City, which was down in Atlanta. Direct action against law enforcement down there. And then, this pro-Palestine stuff, like the A-15. You remember April 15th? Basically, all these pro-Palestine activists and militants went out and blocked the highways and stuff. Other than that, there's really not been anything to speak of after 2021, when the 2020 era riots died down. So today, there's far less urgency and far less enthusiasm among the far left. I listen to their podcasts. I read their blogs. They talk about being demoralized. Someone actually just wrote a week ago how crazy it was to believe that anarchists are going to be able to spin up another insurrection this year. There have been several events that have been canceled. There's one that happens pretty much every year. It's called F the 4th, except they use the real F word. And F the 4th this year was planned for like Seattle and Portland and Houston and Chicago. And nobody expressed any interest in going out and trying to riot on Independence Day, right? That's kind of their middle finger to the founders and that's their anti-colonial protest kind of. And even in Seattle, it was canceled because nobody was going to show up. So I think these mass protests are likely going to be smaller. Again, I'm looking at January 18th, these festivals of resistance. That's going to be a key metric for me. I'm going to follow up and look at how many people show up, and if some of these groups that were highly active in 2020, if they actually show up, then I'll be concerned. If they don't show up, then they're obviously still trying to rebuild. However, even though they are smaller, I actually think we could see more acute violence because there's a certain segment, a certain percentage that are true believers. And they're saying things like protests don't work. Protest is going to do nothing against the Trump administration. Protest basically did nothing last time against the Trump administration, but violence does work. This is not what I'm saying. This is what they say. We could also see class warfare against the wealthy. I was just looking at the far left reaction to this United Health CEO assassination, and they were clearly very supportive. As a matter of fact, they tried to get basically kind of an online campaign going. Any CEO, do this to any CEO, because it's all the capitalist suppressive class, regardless of their politics. Literally do this to any CEO. So that is a little bit concerning to me. Listen, once these deportations start happening under Trump, the social temperature is going to heat up. It's very quiet right now. It's not going to be quiet in another 2 or 3 weeks. And then we get into the most dangerous course of action, which is economic warfare, political violence, terrorism, insurrectionary type violence to end either Trump policies or to end end of the Trump administration. There's a map down here called Choke Points in a Fragile Network. I'll show you a bigger picture of that here in just a moment. But this was circulated back in 2020. And they were really talking about shutting down the U.S. economy. They were saying, look at these choke points in this fragile economic network. We shut down the ports. We shut down key rail intersections. There was a bomb plot against the FedEx facility in Memphis, Tennessee, which is FedEx is a huge carrier of mail and commerce. And their plan really was to shut down the U.S. economy and force Trump from office and basically say, look, they wanted to hold the economy hostage and say, we'll end the blockades. We'll stop shutting down the economy when all Trump has to do is resign. And their plan was to wait this out. And then eventually even moderate Americans would just be like, okay, fine. I just stop blocking the ports so I can get my cheap crap from China, and Trump step down. We don't support you anymore. I'm just telling you that was their plan. And those plans haven't gone anywhere. The people involved in the planning haven't gone anywhere. They're still here. So all they have to do, I think, it would really be just dusted off and then reintroduced at a time when the social temperature is much higher. Remember, they've got to work on expanding these fault lines. They've got to raise the social temperature. They've got to have accelerators of conflict, build up pressure in the system, and then they can get that revolutionary rupture. And this is exactly what they're trying to rebuild. Here's a larger view of this map, by the way. And in a lot of places, Los Angeles and Long Beach, in Vancouver and Seattle, the Port of Oakland, New York, New Jersey. I mean, these are some real far left strongholds. Now, there are a lot more potential courses of action that we could talk about, and we can get a lot more specific about what this means for average Americans. We don't have time to go through the whole list tonight. But I do want to share this image with you. These are upcoming events, and you can't see this real well, but there are over 100 protest and direct action events coming up in the next 2 weeks. And about 24 of these are associated with Antifa and far left groups. And this is the kind of stuff that you're going to see on Fox News after the fact, which is a problem if you or family members are caught up in these protests. And this really is the problem facing the average American or the average Fox News viewer or the average insert news channel here viewer, is that they're going to learn about these mass protests or riots after they're already occurring. And our entire mission here at Early Warning Network is alerting members in advance, which is why I showed you this map of the economic choke points. Well, I'm showing you this map, which will be over 100 protest and direct action events coming up, because these are the places that are going to be targeted. So is it all right if I tell you a little more about what we do here at the Early Warning Network? I hope so. So we're a group of intelligence and special operations veterans, and we track early warning indicators. I want to show you a couple of examples of what I mean by this. So back in December 2019, I was reading through Chinese media that cited Chinese airline data, and it showed that Chinese officials were knowingly putting COVID-19 patients onto flights and sending them into the United States. That was published in a major Chinese news outlet. I did not see it one time on the American news. And so for a couple of weeks, I was reading through this news and looking at all these indicators that said COVID is actually going to be a really big deal. And again, I couldn't foresee the medical implications and all that stuff. One thing I was doing is looking at the market, and it was not reacting at all to COVID. And I don't do this often, but I did send an email out to early warning members on January 22nd, 2020. And I was way too uncomfortable about the market's lack of reaction. And I told everyone that I was selling out of the market because I thought that a major crash was coming. And then the S&P did have successive days of 8% losses and then 10% losses and then 13% losses just over a month later. I'm not a financial advisor. I don't provide financial advice, but when I do see huge asymmetric risk like that, I pass it on. And there are some major investment banks like Citibank and Goldman Sachs that have warned about a market crash or potential for a market crash. And we have let our members, and these are not predictions, we have let our members know exactly what Goldman Sachs is telling their clients, for instance. And then the summer of love kicked off in late May 2020. I've already told you about my work on the far left, which started back in 2016. So from May 2020 to May 2021, which is when most of those riots were dying down, we produced hundreds of intelligence reports on these far left groups, what they were doing, their tactics, what they were planning for in the days and weeks ahead. And we had a ton of early warning network members emailing us to thank us because they were able to avoid those riots and the road blockages and the protests. And we actually had a huge surge in truck drivers becoming members because we would post all the upcoming road blockades that these groups were planning. So vital information for them. And then in October 2020, I started warning that the short-term deflation that we were seeing would eventually subside and that we would start to see a huge spike of inflation. And when we started talking about this back in October 2020, very few financial, quote unquote, financial experts and news outlets were talking about this. And so I started making a list of traders that I followed. And some of them are big name investors. There's some more obscure traders and hedge fund managers that you've never heard of, unless you work in finance. And I chose to follow these guys and started following them and tracking everything that they were saying and telling their clients because they had an excellent track record. And I called this my smart money inflation tracker. And the aggregate of what they were telling their clients was far more accurate than anything coming out of the mainstream media or even financial outlets. And so we were able to keep early warning members informed about how bad the inflation problem would be. And this is before mainstream news outlets started talking about it. They didn't really start talking about it until this big uptick later in like February 21. And so we kept early warning members informed. We provided them with recommendations about how to cope with inflation, what they could do to prepare for that. And we still run that weekly economic early warning report. And we tell our members what hedge funds and investment banks are telling their high net worth clients. We think you deserve to know that as well. And if we have more time, I'll tell you more about what I think is going to happen to the economy this year, but we don't have time. And then another one of our big calls was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In fact, we published a video on YouTube predicting that Russia would invade Ukraine in 90 days. And that was on November 24th, 2021. And Russia invaded 90 days later to the day on February 24th, 2022. And that's when bankers and hedge funds started following us, and they started emailing us and following our work because they realized that they could make massive amounts of money if they had these early indicators for these types of events. And I'm not trying to brag. I'm just telling you that we love our country. We have homes and families here. Our lives are here, and we don't want anything bad to happen. We don't want to see anything bad. But we're in the office every day, and we're tracking these indicators. We're looking through these data points, and when we see something major taking shape, we will always let you know. And that's one of the biggest reasons why you should become an early warning member. We produce the best 5-minute intelligence brief available without a top secret clearance every day, Monday through Friday. It's called the morning briefing. And it's what you get when intelligence and special operations veterans start what is essentially a news service. We have members tell us all the time that they've stopped watching traditional news because if it's important enough to know about, they will hear it in our briefings. And that is certainly true. So I want to invite you to become an early warning member tonight. If you join tonight, here's what's going to happen. First, you'll start receiving our morning intel briefing. And if you'd like to sign up, I'll give you the link right here. You can go to www.earlywarningnetwork.com/offer. It's also in the chat for you. In our morning briefing, we talk about what's happening inside the Beltway, and we cover national security concerns like few others can. We monitor U.S. agriculture and supply chain conditions, along with the energy sector, the power grid, other critical infrastructure. And by the way, if you haven't heard, the threats to the power grid are actually a big deal. And we talk about that frequently. We also update a map with protest locations, and we monitor everything from protest groups to violent social movements. We're also tracking the latest developments between NATO and Russia and between the United States and China. And you might think that staying up to date on these issues is the biggest benefit of early warning, but it's actually not. By far, the biggest benefit that you have as a member of Early Warning Network is you get a team of intel veterans telling you what's normal and what's abnormal. So you don't have to waste time or worry about the latest pants on fire news article or the latest freak out on social media or YouTube. When we see something that we believe is a big risk, we alert you to it. We let you know what's going on early. And that gives you time to prepare or make decisions about your daily routines and your family safety, because no one wants to get caught in a bad situation, especially when it was foreseeable. We don't want to have these threats or hazards. We don't want to be unprepared for these threats or hazards when someone can see them coming. And that's what we specialize in here at Early Warning. And that's what not only makes us different, but also better than traditional news, because you're going to hear about this stuff after it happens on the news. You can read our morning briefing via email. You can read the report online. You can watch the briefing live. It's every morning at 8 a.m. Central Time. It's also recorded, so you can watch it later, or you can listen to the podcast version. Each briefing is about 20 minutes. We cover everything we think you should know, and then we leave out everything else, so we're not wasting any of your time. You'll also get access to the Early Warning Network app that does come on Apple and Android devices. So that'll load onto your phone or your tablet. I understand not everyone likes apps, so you can also access our Intel platform through the web. Just log in through your internet browser. We launched the app last year because a lot of our members wanted to be alerted when they're out and about. So they said, look, just give us a push notification through our phone if something major is going on. We're also, we've been testing out something on the app called the Watch Floor, and that's going to provide an automated real-time stream of headlines that are directed by our Intel team. So when there is some national emergency and you want the latest intel from the people who actually know what's going on, then you can check in with us through the app. You'll also get access to our riot and protest tracker that's on a tab right inside the app. It's updated daily. And so when these mass protests start in these cities and the state capitals and even in some smaller metro areas, we'll let you know where they are and when they're going to happen, and if you should be concerned about political violence. You'll also get access to the Early Warning Ham Radio Hub. Now, we have been working with ham radio operators to get our reports out via ham radio, just in case the power or the internet goes down. We, of course, welcome all ham radio operators. If you want to get your ham radio license, this is a really good place to start. And then, of course, I know a lot of people don't want to get their ham radio license, but let me tell you, if you have a shortwave radio and a laptop, you'll still be able to receive our latest intel reports. And we're doing this because we are concerned about cyber attacks and a potential crisis or conflict with China, where maybe our power grid is under attack, or maybe the internet access is not dependable. And so quality information during this emergency is going to be virtually non-existent. So we want to use this ham radio network to still be able to push out critical information. It is going to be an invaluable solution to a lot of people's problems. Now, there are a lot more features that you can see for yourself. If you want to start your membership, you can head on over to, again, www.earlywarningnetwork.com/offer. You can also click the link that I put into the chat. We'd love to have you on board. Now, before we get to tonight's bonus items that you'll get just for signing up, I want to tell you one other thing, and that is about the Early Warning team. So one of the things that makes us unique is our team. We're not political pundits. We're not journalists. We're not random guys with Twitter accounts. We all have defense and intelligence experience. I've already told you about myself. Mark runs the morning briefing. He's a veteran with a background in intelligence and special operations. He also has an MBA from Georgetown. He's just an extremely sharp guy. Jared is a Navy veteran. He was an electronic warfare technician and instructor. He looks at Chinese Navy. That's his primary coverage area. He also tracks Chinese activity in the Western Hemisphere. Robert is an all-source intelligence analyst in the Army. He covers domestic politics and critical infrastructure. And then we have Max. He is a retired lieutenant colonel from the Marine Corps. He also spent 10 years at CIA as a paramilitary operations officer. And this team that you're getting for the cost of your membership is absolutely incredible. When Trump takes office and he's met with another national emergency, you're going to get this dedicated team to churn out intelligence updates. And the end result is that you're going to know the truth, which you're probably not going to be getting from the mainstream news. And you're going to know it sooner. And the result is that you are going to be able to act faster. Now, if you sign up with us tonight, we're going to throw in these bonuses, almost $1,000 worth of bonuses. A watch floor membership costs $199 for the next 12 months. Think about how long the next 12 months is going to be, considering all the things that are going to happen over the next 12 months. And so I want to put this into perspective. So let's say that you spent the money that I spend over $100,000 a year on access to information, because we got big data platforms. We got foreign media platforms. We got foreign media stuff that you will never see in American media. So let's say that you had access to all those sources for free and you didn't have to pay for them, and you could produce everything that we do. Let's just say that you could do it. You can't, but let's just say that you could do it for 10 hours. You could do it in 10 hours per day. And you're a middle-class earner who earns $25 an hour. That's $250 a day, $1,000 a week, $4,000 a month, about $48,000 per year. And then if you make $50 an hour, you're getting $100,000 of your time back for a grand total of $199. That's a pretty good trade. So if nothing else, we are giving you your time back. I had a guy tell me that he didn't have time to read our 5-minute intel briefs or watch the 20-minute live stream. And I asked him if he watched the news. And after some back and forth, he admitted that he did watch a couple hours of the news every day. And you can learn more in our 5-minute report than you can from days worth of the news, because they don't touch this stuff. They don't follow the news sources we do. They don't report on the same stuff we do. If you want to get Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake and whatever the latest Hollywood thing is, yeah, sure, turn into Fox News. If you want to get real hard-hitting, real-world stuff, you'll catch it here on Early Warning Network. Another one of the things that makes us unique is we spend a lot of time making sure that everything we write is clear and concise. There's that Mark Twain quote. He once wrote a letter to a friend and he said, "I would have written you a shorter note, but I didn't have the time." And so there's a reason why you can read our intel brief in 5 minutes. And that's because Mark and I are ruthless about what makes it into the report. And then we make sure that it's well written before it goes out. Because if something is difficult to read, then you don't read it. And when you don't read it, you miss out. And I don't want anyone to miss out. So our briefs are easy to read. And with that, everyone, I want to open up the floor to questions here. If you do have any questions whatsoever, I would love to have you as an Early Warning Network member. There's the link to join us tonight. You get all these bonuses. Let's go back. The Antifa library, that's stuff that I've collected over 10 years. You know, I said I always go to the anarchist book fairs and everything they have. And here's one of the things, how to organize an insurrection. So these are all digitized PDFs. Here's another one called Blocks and Tactical Evolution. I bought this for $4 at a anti-fascist or anarchist book fair. And so you'll get that. So if you want to see the primary sources of the stuff that they're actually talking about and teaching others, you can download that in the Antifa library. There's also the Intelligence 101 video series. So that's a 3-part video series. It runs just over an hour. And I teach you about intelligence collection and analysis. So you can do that on your own where you live. There's also the low intensity conflict primer. So if you want a guide to everything from violent social movements and terrorism, insurgency, popular revolutions, color revolutions, and everything in between, I break that down in this low-intensity conflict primer. There's also the hyperinflation survival guide. Back in 2021, I did a deep dive. I went back and read over a dozen books about hyperinflation all over the world. And there was a handful of things that I found in there. There was actually incredible advice, like the things that the people did to navigate hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation is not a near-term concern of mine, but I think a lot has to happen for us to get to hyperinflation. But listen, there's 5 things. I went down and after I studied all these hyperinflation events, identified 5 things that governments and central banks have to avoid in order to, or have to not do in order to avoid hyperinflation. And the Fed and the Treasury right now are doing 3 of those 5 things. The 5 things that they should not be doing, they're doing 3 of the 5, which is a little concerning. And so in there, I go through and I talk about how to navigate hyperinflation. It's not, I don't tell you to buy gold. It's real world stuff on how to navigate hyperinflation. And now people are talking about another uptick in inflation. So you can take those same strategies and apply them to any inflationary environment as well. There's also the Unrestricted Warfare book summary. So in the late 1990s, 2 Chinese PLA colonels, People's Liberation Army colonels, wrote what's really a manual on how to defeat the United States. So I went through there, took notes chapter by chapter. I give you the book summary along with my notes. And you read a lot of this stuff, and they talk about using pandemics to defeat foreign countries. Talk about cyber attacks. They talk about stock market crashes. And again, this is back in the late 1990s. And so a lot of the stuff that you read in there today, I read it back in, well, I did the book summary back in 2020, but you read through that stuff. And then you follow the things that China is doing today, and it's very concerning. And then finally, there's our strategic intelligence, which is being updated for 2025. About every 6 months, Jared goes through and he looks at every country individually, and he determines if they are leaning towards China, or if they're in China's sphere of influence, or if they're in the U.S. sphere of influence, or if they're leaning towards the United States. And it's been very interesting to watch the world. Every 6 months when he does these updates, it's been very interesting to watch the world change and, go into like Cold War era type blocks, Cold War 2.0 type international blocks. And so you'll also get that report for free. And a lot of people are talking about establishing residency overseas, moving to a foreign country. Listen, before you do that, read this report, because I've had folks go down to Panama and they get down there. They're like, this place is a Chinese colony. There's so many Chinese stores. There's so many Chinese people in Panama now. And they realize, yeah, they probably don't want to go live in Panama anymore. And we talk about some of that stuff in the Strategic Intelligence Report. All right, so here's everything that's included. If anyone has any questions about anything we covered tonight, or any questions about early warning, I'd be happy to answer them now. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you sign up tonight and in like 3 or 4 days, you're like, I don't really like this, just send me an email. I will refund your subscription. No questions asked. Well, I'll ask you like maybe what you didn't like about it. But, I'm not going to be a jerk about it. If you sign up and you don't want to be here anymore, that's fine. I will happily refund you your money, and you can go back to watching Fox News or wherever you get your news from. All right. Well, everyone, again, thanks for being here. You can check us out at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. We're also up on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and wherever else you might be. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your evening. And until next time, be well and stay out front.